The first 3 minutes immerse the viewer in the suffocating scale of the Eastern Front. We open with high-altitude maps showing the German Operation Barbarossa slicing through Soviet territory. The narrator explains the myth of the T-34. Everyone thinks the Soviet tanks were the stars, but we see the grim reality. Thousands of these world-class tanks abandoned on the side of the road, perfectly intact, simply because they ran out of fuel. The Red Army was a giant with no blood flow. We see archival footage of Soviet soldiers desperately trying to pull heavy artillery through knee-deep mud using teams of 20 men and exhausted horses. The message is clear. You can have 10 million soldiers, but they are just targets if they can't move. By minute 4, the script shifts to the horse-drawn tragedy. We dive into the shocking statistics. In 1941, the Soviet Union relied on over 1 million horses for transport. We see the brutal irony of a modern 20th century war being fought with 19th century speed. The narrator describes the Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season, as a literal ocean of sludge that swallowed the Soviet supply lines whole. We hear the frantic cables sent from Moscow to Washington. Stalin wasn't just asking for guns, he was begging for wheels. There's a cinematic focus on the broken rail problem. The German Luftwaffe had destroyed the Soviet train hubs, meaning that once a soldier stepped off a train, he had to walk 500 miles to the front, carrying his own food and ammo. The final 2 minutes of the act focus on the industrial ghost town. We see the Soviet factories being dismantled and moved east to the Ural Mountains to escape the Nazis. It was a heroic feat, but it left a production gap. The Soviets could either build tanks or they could build trucks. They didn't have the steel for both. We witness the cold, hard math of the Kremlin. If they built the trucks themselves, they would lose the war before the first one rolled off the line. The act ends on a haunting shot of a Soviet general looking at a map of a crumbling front line, realizing that the great patriotic war was about to end in a starving, frozen silence unless a miracle arrived from across the Atlantic. The screen fades to black as the first American convoy is sighted in the distance. The turning point of the war didn't happen in a boardroom or a bunker. It happened on the docks of the Persian Corridor and the frozen ports of Vladivostok. As the cranes swung over the decks of American Liberty ships, they lowered something the Soviet soldier had only seen in dreams: the Studebaker US6. To the Americans, it was a 2.5-ton utility vehicle. To the Red Army, it was a god. The first 3 minutes of this sequence focus on the culture shock of engineering. We see Soviet mechanics, men used to the temperamental and fragile engines of their own domestic trucks, opening the hoods of these American beasts. They found engines that started in 40 below zero temperatures and transmissions that could survive the Rasputitsa, the legendary Russian mud that had swallowed entire German panzer divisions. While the German trucks relied on complex, delicate parts that broke in the cold, the American Studebaker was built with farmer logic. It was rugged, simple, and virtually indestructible. The narrative shifts to the motorization of the juggernaut. We witness the transformation of the Soviet infantry. No longer were they marching toward Berlin at 3 miles per hour. Suddenly, entire divisions were being loaded into the backs of American trucks and moved 60 miles in a single night. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a tactical revolution. It allowed the Soviet Union to perform deep battle maneuvers, striking the Germans, then disappearing and reappearing 40 miles away before the enemy could even regroup. The German high command was baffled. They were fighting an army that moved with a speed they didn't think the Soviets were capable of.
Then we look at the Stalin's organ secret. One of the most terrifying weapons of the war was the Katyusha rocket launcher. But there was a hidden truth the Soviet propaganda machines tried to bury. The Katyusha was so heavy and had such a violent recoil that it would flip a Soviet-made truck on its side. It was only when the Soviets began mounting these massive rocket rails onto the back of the American Studebaker chassis that the weapon became truly mobile. We see the terrifying sight of hundreds of American trucks lined up in the snow, unleashing a wall of fire that broke the back of the Wehrmacht, powered by Indiana steel and American horsepower. The final minutes of the act explore the King of the Road legend. The Soviet soldiers developed a genuine love for these machines, nicknamed the Studer. We see scenes of soldiers decorating their trucks, treating them more care than their own rifles. The truck became the lifeline, carrying the bread that fed the cities, the shells that fed the guns, and the fuel that kept the T-34s moving. By the end of this act, the steamroller is no longer a metaphor. It is a literal, motorized force of 400,000 American engines screaming toward the German border. The act closes on a chilling image, a massive column of American trucks stretching as far as the eye can see, disappearing into the smoke of the western horizon, leaving the era of the horse and wagon in the dust of history.
The war in Europe didn't end with a Soviet tank. It ended with a Soviet general staring at an American logistics report. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of the Reichstag, the Soviet Union faced a choice: acknowledge the miracle that had carried them from Moscow to Berlin, or begin the greatest erase in historical history. The first 3 minutes of this final act take us inside the Iron Curtain's first secret. We see the immediate post-war period where the 400,000 American trucks that had won the war were suddenly scrubbed of their Made in USA plates. The Soviet propaganda machine began airbrushing photos, removing the recognizable grills of the Studebakers and replacing them with generic Soviet shapes in official paintings. The government wanted the people to believe that communist industry had done it all alone. But behind closed doors, the truth was escaping. We dive into the Zhukov confession. We see the legendary Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who took Berlin, speaking in a wiretapped room in 1963. He didn't know the KGB was listening when he whispered the truth. People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. He specifically mentioned the trucks. He admitted that without American transport, the Soviet artillery would have been stationary and their soldiers would have been starving in the trenches. The script then pivots to the economic death sentence. We look at the chilling math provided by Nikita Khrushchev years later. He admitted that if the Soviet Union had been forced to build those 400,000 trucks themselves, they would have had to stop production on the T-34 tank entirely. The math was simple and brutal. No American trucks meant no Soviet tanks. No Soviet tanks meant a German victory. We see a visual comparison of the two industrial giants, the U.S. assembly lines churning out a truck every few minutes, while the Soviet factories struggled to even produce enough boots for their men. The final 2 minutes of the video focus on the ghost of the Studebaker. We see a montage of these American trucks continuing to work on Soviet farms and construction sites well into the 1960s. They were the silent backbone of the USSR's recovery long after the war was over. The video ends on a powerful, reflective shot, a modern-day Russian field where a rusted, skeletal frame of an American truck still sits half buried in the soil. The narrator concludes with the ultimate realization. The Cold War was a lie. The very superpower that would spend the next 40 years threatening the West was only able to survive because of the gifts of capitalism. The 400,000 trucks weren't just a military aid package, they were the literal legs of the Soviet Empire, legs that were manufactured in South Bend, Indiana.